The earth trembles before the sound actually arrives, a deep, resonant vibration that starts in the soles of your feet and climbs up your spine, shaking the very air in your lungs. On the tarmac, the heat haze shimmers violently, distorting the horizon as four massive General Electric F-101 and GA-1T turbofan engines begin to spool up, whining like captured banshees before dropping into a guttural, thunderous roar. This is the symphony of the B-1B Lancer, a machine that does not just fly, it tears a hole through the atmosphere, forcing the sky to submit to its will. To the crews who fly her, she is simply the Bone, a phonetic play on B-1, but the nickname carries a weightier, more skeletal connotation, something stripped down, lethal, and elemental. As the pilot pushes the throttles past the detent and into full afterburner, four cones of blue-white fire erupt from the exhaust nozzles, instantly turning the twilight runway into day. The brakes release, and 400,000 pounds of American engineering hurtle forward, the variable geometry wings swept forward like a bird of prey spreading its talons, hunting for lift. The noise is not just loud, it is physical, a crushing pressure that signals the departure of the most versatile, misunderstood, and devastating bomber in the history of warfare. To understand the soul of the Lancer, you must first understand the shadow in which it was born. The B-1 was not designed for the dusty insurgencies of the Middle East or the precision strikes of the modern era. It was forged in the paranoia and existential dread of the Cold War. In the 1970s, the strategic reality was grim. The Soviet Union possessed a dense forest of surface-to-air missiles and high-altitude interceptors that made the venerable 52 Stratofortress look like a slow, fat target. The United States needed a knife in the dark, something that could slip up under the radar curtain, flying so fast and so low that, by the time the Russians saw it, the sun would already be rising on a radioactive wasteland. The initial concept, the B-1A, was a creature of pure speed, designed to dash at Mach 2 at high altitude. The game changed. Soviet look-down, shoot-down radar technology improved, rendering high-altitude speed suicidal. President Carter canceled the program, banking on stealth and cruise missiles. But the Reagan administration brought it back, reborn as the B-1B. It was slower at high altitude than its predecessor, but it was gifted with a new, more terrifying capability: the ability to fly at nearly the speed of sound while skimming the treetops, guided by a terrain-following radar that allowed it to hug the contours of the Earth in pitch blackness, invisible to the enemy eyes watching the skies above. Imagine the cockpit in those early days. It is a cramped, utilitarian space, smelling of avionics coolant and old metal. There are four crew members, the aircraft commander and pilot in the front, and the offensive and defensive systems operators, the OSOs and DSOs, sitting in a windowless kitchen illuminated only by the glow of radar screens. They were training for the end of the world. The mission profile was the stuff of nightmares. Take off on a moment's notice, refuel over the Arctic ice, and then drop down to 200 feet above the ground, racing at 600 miles per hour through the valleys of the Soviet Union. At that speed, the world outside is a blur of gray and green, a sensory overload that the human brain can barely process. The computer flies the plane, jerking the controls to clear ridges and power lines, while the pilots keep their hands hovering over the stick, ready to take over if the system fails, because if it fails at that altitude, they have less than 3 seconds before they become a crater. For years, this was the Lancer's silent war, a constant state of readiness everyone hoped would never come. They were the nuclear arrow in America's quiver, sharp, hidden, and deadly. But the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed, dissolving the threat the B-1 was built to counter. Suddenly, the Bone was a warrior without a war, a nuclear relic in a world breathing a sigh of relief. Critics called it a white elephant, a hangar queen, too complex and expensive to maintain, with no purpose in the New World Order. They were wrong. The Lancer was about to undergo one of the most dramatic metamorphoses in military aviation history. The Air Force stripped it of its nuclear mission, initiating the Conventional Mission Upgrade Program. They rewired the beast, teaching it to dry iron bombs, cluster munitions, and eventually, the smart weapons that would define 21st century combat. The low-level penetrator was about to become the ultimate heavy lifter of the conventional battlefield. The vindication came in the desert night of December 1998. Operation Desert Fox was the B-1D's combat debut. Saddam Hussein was playing games with UN weapons inspectors, and the patience of the West had run out. For the crews of the 7th and 28th Bomb Wings, this was the moment of truth. The training sorties over the Dakotas and Texas were over. The anti-aircraft artillery over Iraq was real. As the Lancers crossed into Iraqi airspace, they didn't just bring a few bombs, they brought an apocalypse. A single B-1B can carry more ordnance than an B-52, a staggering payload capacity that allows it to act as a flying magazine. In those first nights, they targeted the Republican Guard, barracks, and command centers. The darkness below erupted as dozens of 500-pound MK-82 bombs walked across the targets, turning military infrastructure into dust. The B-1s proved they could penetrate contested airspace, deliver a crushing blow, and return home. The The Hangar Queen had drawn first blood, and the pilots who flew her realized that the Bone was far more agile and survivable than the critics claimed. However, it was the skies over Serbia and Kosovo in 1999, during Operation Allied Force, that truly cemented the B-1's reputation. The conflict was a different beast, political, messy, and requiring precision. The B-1s flew from RAF Fairford in England, embarking on long-duration sorties that tested the endurance of both machine and man. They were no longer just dropping dumb bombs. They were dropping the Mk-82s in massive quantities to break the Serbian army's hold on the ground. The statistics from that campaign are staggering. The B-1B fleet flew less than 2% of the total combat sorties flown by the coalition, yet they delivered over 20% of the total ordnance tonnage. It was a masterclass in efficiency. 6 Lancers could do the work of a swarm of smaller fighters, staying on station for hours, waiting for targets to reveal themselves. The crews learned to sleep in shifts, curling up on the floor of the cockpit, eating cold MREs, while the autopilot held them in loitering orbits. They were becoming the hawks of the night, always there, always watching, and capable of raining down destruction on a scale terrified the enemy on the ground. Then came the day the world changed. September 11, 2001. As the towers fell and the dust settled over New York, the United States turned its gaze toward Afghanistan, a landlocked fortress of mountains and caves. This was not a war of tank columns and industrial targets. It was a war of pickup trucks, caves, and fleeting shadows. It seemed like the wrong war for a supersonic strategic bomber. How could a massive jet designed to nuke Moscow help a special forces team pinned down in a valley? The answer lay in the B-1's unique combination of speed, loiter time, and payload. The Bone was about to become the world's largest, fastest close air support aircraft. In the early days of Operation Enduring Freedom, the skies over Afghanistan were empty of traditional targets. There were no factories, no large airfields. The targets were the Taliban front lines. The B-1s would take off from Diego Garcia, a tiny speck of coral in the Indian Ocean, and fly thousands of miles to the combat zone. Once there, they didn't just drop their bombs and leave. They stayed. With their wings swept forward for maximum lift and fuel efficiency, they orbited high above the Hindu Kuh, waiting for the call. And the calls came. Down in the mud and snow, Green Berets and Delta Force operators, often on horseback, were directing the war with laser designators and radios. When they made contact with the enemy, they didn't need a strafing run from a fighter that would have to leave in 10 minutes to refuel. They needed a hammer that could stay in the fight all day. Bone 23, this is Jaguar 1, troops in contact, request immediate support. The radio would crackle. In the back of the B-1, the offensive systems operator would punch the coordinates into the computer. The pilot would snap the throttles forward, and the massive bomber, already high in the thin air, would surge toward the fight. To the Taliban, the B-1 was a terrifying ghost. They couldn't see it was too high. They couldn't hear it was too fast. The first warning they had was the whistling shriek of a joint attack munition, JDAM, seconds before impact. The B-1 could drop a single 1,000-pound bomb with surgical precision on a cave entrance, or it could ripple 20 bombs in a line to decimate an ambush. The persistence of the B-1 changed the psychology of the battlefield. American troops knew that if the Bone was overhead, they were never alone. They called it B-1 rain, the sound of heavy ordnance saving their lives. One of the most dramatic illustrations of this new era occurred during the Battle of Kalai Jangi, a fortress uprising where hundreds of Taliban prisoners revolted. The situation was chaotic, a swirling melee of friendly forces and enemies in close quarters. B-1s were stacked overhead, dropping JDAMs in danger-close distances of British and American special operators. The margin for error was non-existent. The backseaters in the B-1, staring at their radar maps and targeting pods, had to trust the voices on the radio implicitly. The pilots had to maneuver a 200-ton aircraft with the delicacy of a surgeon, battling crosswinds and fatigue. They dropped bomb after bomb, breaking the back of the uprising. It was a far cry from the nuclear dash over the pole, but it was warfare in its rawest, most desperate form. As the global war on terror expanded into Iraq in 2003, the B-1 was again at the tip of the spear. Operation Iraqi Freedom began with a decapitation strike, a tentative attempt to kill Saddam Hussein at a location known as Dora Farms. Intelligence had pinpointed his location. A B-1B was already in the air, loitering. The coordinates were beamed to the aircraft. The crew didn't hesitate. They pushed the throttles, the afterburners lighting up the night, and raced toward Baghdad. Within minutes, 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs were on their way. They impacted with earth-shattering force. While Saddam survived that night, the mission demonstrated the time-sensitive targeting capability of the Lancer. It proved that a strategic bomber could react with the speed of a tactical fighter, shrinking the kill chain to mere minutes. The invasion of Iraq saw the B-1s performing shock and awe in the most literal sense. In the midst of sandstorms that grounded other aircraft, the B-1's synthetic aperture radar could see through the dust as if it were clear day. They hunted Republican Guard divisions in the open desert, obliterating tanks and artillery before they could fire a shot. The Pilots would describe the sky over Baghdad as a fireworks display of anti-aircraft fire, a deadly curtain they had to weave through. But the B-1's defensive systems, the jamming pods and decoys managed by the defensive systems operator, worked overtime, creating electronic ghosts that confused Iraqi radars. The Bone would sweep its wings back, drop to supersonic speeds, and punch through the defenses, leaving sonic booms and destroyed targets in its wake. But the glory of combat came with a cost. The B-1 was being flown harder and longer than its designers ever intended. These were aircraft built for short, high-speed nuclear dashes, now flying 12, 15, sometimes 24-hour missions, day after day, year after year. The airframes groaned under the stress. Cracks appeared in the wings. Hydraulics leaked. The avionics, though upgraded, were a patchwork of old and new. The maintainers on the ground became the unsung heroes of the B-1 story. In the searing heat of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, or the freezing winds of Ellsworth Air Base in South Dakota, they worked around the clock to keep the Bones flying. Changing a tire on a B-1 is a heavy industrial operation. Changing an engine is a feat of engineering. Yet, the mission-capable rates held. The B-1 crews and their ground teams developed a cult-like devotion to the airframe. They knew she was temperamental. They knew she leaked fuel on the ramp like a territorial beast marking its spot. But they also knew that when the chips were down, she would take off, she would carry the load, and she would bring them home. The versatility of the platform was pushed even further during Operation Odyssey Dawn in 2011, the intervention in Libya. This showcased the B-1's global strike capability. The mission didn't start from a forward base in the Middle East. It started in the windswept plains of South Dakota. B-1s from Ellsworth Air Force Base took off, flew across the Atlantic Ocean, refueled multiple times in midair, struck targets in Libya, and then turned around and flew back to the United States. It was a non-stop marathon of endurance, a demonstration to the world that the United States could strike any target on the globe from its home soil. Inside the cockpit, the crews battled exhaustion. They rotated sleep shifts, but the adrenaline of combat and the physical discomfort of the ejection seats made rest difficult. The pilots had to maintain formation while taking fuel from a tanker in turbulence, a delicate dance of heavy metal at 30,000 feet where a single mistake could be fatal. When they finally touched down back in South Dakota, they had been in the air for over 24 hours, their bodies stiff, their ears ringing, but their mission accomplished. They had destroyed Libyan air defense sites and ammunition depots, crippling the regime's ability to attack civilians, all without ever landing on foreign soil. As the years ground on, the enemy evolved, and the B-1 evolved with them. In 2014, when ISIS swept across Syria and Iraq, the B-1 was the first to answer the call for the defense of Kobani. The Kurdish defenders were surrounded, their backs to the Turkish border, facing a massacre. The B-1s arrived like avenging angels. For months, they flew over the city, dropping record numbers of munitions. The precision was now absolute. The sniper targeting pods allowed the crews to distinguish between held by ISIS and one held by friendlies just across the street. The offensive systems operator could zoom in and see individual fighters, vehicles, and fighting positions. The B-1s dropped so many bombs that the depots began to run low on JDAM kits. They broke the siege of Kobani from 20,000 feet, turning the tide of the war against the caliphate. It was a grueling campaign of attrition, where the B-1's ability to carry 24 and 30 versus 2 B bombs, or a mix of smaller weapons, meant it could stay in the fight long after the F-15s and F-16 had to return to base. The culmination of the B-1's evolution into a stand-up weapon came in April 2018. The Assad regime in Syria had used chemical weapons against its own people, crossing a red line. The response had to be swift and punitive. 2 B-1Bs deployed to the region, but this time they didn't need to fly directly over the targets. They were loaded with the AGM-158 JASSM-ER Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, extended range. These were stealthy cruise missiles with a range of over 500 miles. The B-1s launched 19 of these missiles from a safe distance, watching as they separated from the rotary launchers in the bomb bays, their small wings deploying as their engines ignited. The missiles flew autonomously, hugging the terrain, invisible to radar, and slammed into the Barza Research and Development Center in Damascus. It was the first combat use of the JASSM-ER, and it proved that the B-1 remained relevant even in an era of advanced air defenses. It could stand outside the ring of fire and reach in with a long arm to destroy the most heavily defended targets. Yet, amidst the high-tech wizardry and the geopolitical maneuvering, the B-1 remains a visceral, mechanical beast. Ask any pilot about the low-level training flights, and their eyes will light up. There is a specific training route in the United States, IR-178, that winds through the canyons. Taking a B-1 through there is like threading a needle with a sledgehammer. The wings are swept all the way back to 67.5 degrees, transforming the bomber into a dart. The sensation of speed is overwhelming. The ground rushes by in a blur. The altimeter reads 500 feet, sometimes lower. The mountains tower above the cockpit canopy. The aircraft buffets in the thermal currents, bucking and kicking. It requires a physical physical wrestle with the stick. The pilots can see hikers on the ridges looking down at them. It is in these moments that the spirit of the B-1 is most alive, not as a computer platform, but as a hot rod, a marvel of aerodynamics that defies the laws of physics for a creature of its size. There are stories, too, of the close calls, the moments where the bone almost didn't make it back. There was the incident where a B-1 experienced a critical wing sweep failure during combat operations, forcing the crew to land at high speed, tires smoking and brakes glowing cherry red. There were engine fires that lit up the night sky, forcing emergency diverts into friendly airfields where the crews were pulled from the jets by firefighters. There was the terrifying incident where an ejection seat failed to fire during a doomed training flight. The aircraft commander ordered the rest of the crew to bail out, but the offensive systems operator's seat wouldn't launch. In a display of supreme heroism and airmanship, the pilot refused to eject and leave his crewmate behind. He wrestled the crippled bomber to a belly landing, saving the life of the operator in the back. These stories are whispered in the bars of the officers' clubs, binding the B-1 community together in a brotherhood of survival. The interior of the B-1 during a combat run is a study in controlled chaos. The two pilots in the front are managing the Energista jet, watching for threats, and communicating with the AWACS, Airborne Warning and Control System. In the back, the OSO is the quarterback of the bombing run. His fingers fly across the keyboard and the hand controllers, slewing the targeting pod, designating aim points, and selecting weapon fusing. Doors coming open, he announces over the intercom. The hum of the hydraulics vibrates through the floor. Ready, release. The aircraft lurches upward, suddenly thousands of pounds lighter. Weapons away. Timed impact 30 seconds. The DSO monitors the threat scope, watching for the telltale spikes of enemy radar. If a missile launch is detected, he shouts brake left and deploys chaff and flares. The pilot cranks the yoke, pulling G's that crush the crew into their seats, the G-suit bladders inflating to squeeze the blood back into their brains. The B-1 is not a fighter, but when it maneuvers, it moves with a terrifying momentum, a mountain dancing in the sky. Today, the B-1B Lancer is in the twilight of its career. The B-21 Raider is on the horizon, a stealthy flying wing that looks like a spaceship from the future. The B-1s are being retired one by one, sent to the boneyard in Arizona, where the dry desert air preserves their metal carcasses. But the bone is not going quietly. It is being flown harder now than ever before. The Air Force has started experimenting with external pylons again, equipping the B-1 to carry hypersonic missiles, turning it into a high-speed arsenal ship for the Pacific Theater. It is conducting bomber task force missions, flying near the borders of Russia and China to remind the world that American air power can still reach anywhere, anytime. The legacy of the B-1B is not written in the nuclear fire it was built to unleash, but in the thousands of conventional sorties it flew to protect soldiers on the ground. It is written in the silence of the Afghan valleys after a JDAM strike ended a firefight. It is written in the awe of the crowds at air shows who cover their ears as the bone performs a high-speed pass, the shockwave hitting them in the chest. It is a complicated legacy of a plane that was canceled, revived, repurposed, and ridden hard. It is a testament to the adaptability of the American airman and the enduring value of heavy metal in the sky. When the last B-1B finally shuts down its engines for the last time, years from now, it will mark the end of an era. The age of the supersonic, variable sweep bomber will be over. There will be no more thunderous afterburner takeoffs that shake the fillings in your teeth. There will be no more terrain following rides through the canyons. But until that day comes, Lancer remains on the ramp, dripping hydraulic fluid. It's scarred and weathered, waiting for the call. The crew climbs the ladder, straps into the eject seats, and puts on their helmets. The auxiliary power unit winds to life. The ground crew pulls the chocks. The bone is awake, and somewhere in the world, the bad guys are about to have a very, very bad day. The pilot taxis to the hold short line, checks the instruments, and looks down the runway. It's time to go to work. The throttles go forward. The burners light. The earth shakes. The bone flies on. In the grand tapestry of military aviation, there are planes that are loved for their beauty, like the Spitfire, and planes that are respected for their toughness, like the A-10. The B-1B Lancer commands a different kind of respect, a mixture of fear and awe. It is a brute, a brawler, a heavyweight champion that learned to box with the grace of a lightweight. It bridges the gap between the analog past and the digital future. It carried the burden of the Cold War and the heat of the war on terror. It is imperfect, maintenance-heavy, and loud, but for the infantryman pinned down in a ditch, looking up at the gray sky and praying for a miracle, the silhouette of the swept-wing bomber and the roar of its engines is the most beautiful sound in the world. It is the sound of deliverance. It is the sound of the bone. This dramatic art, from the drawing boards of the 1970s to the hypersonic tests of the 2020s, encapsulates the story of the B-1B. It is a story of survival, adaptation, and overwhelming firepower. It is a script written in jet fuel and high explosives, acted out by men and women who strap themselves into a supersonic tube and hurl themselves into the teeth of enemy defenses. As the sun sets on the B-1 fleet, the silhouette against the dying light is iconic. iconic, a reminder that peace is often kept by those willing to carry the heaviest sword. The B-1B Lancer, the bone, the savior, the thunder. Long may she reign.